Hi everyone, welcome to Poisonous People. Today we're going to begin the Narcissism Storytelling Project. This is the first video in the series, and so if you're not sure how this is going to work, be sure to watch the video titled The Narcissism Storytelling Project User Manual for more details. This is the story of how I believe I became arrogant. This story begins when I was 3 years old. It came to my mother's attention that I had become somewhat constipated. So she brought me to the pediatrician and he prescribed a children's suppository. And later that day, when we got home from the doctor, my mom got the prescription and she called me over to give me my first dose of my new medicine. Now, at 3 years old, it doesn't occur to me that medication could be administered in any way other than orally. So you can imagine my shock. It was perhaps the most unpleasant thing I had ever experienced in my little 3-year lifespan. And to make matters worse, this was the kind of suppository that had to be refrigerated. So not only was it extremely unpleasant, it was freezing. And I made up my mind after just one dose, there is no way I am ever doing this again. So the following day, when my mother called me, I ran. And she chased me all over the house and it ended up I got my second suppository. On the third day, my mother called me and I ran and hid, but she found where I was hiding, so I got my suppository. On the fourth day, my mother called my name. I ran, I hid, she found me, but I decided to do that toddler thing where you just become dead weight. And I sat on the floor. She picked me up off the floor and I got my suppository. So the next day, I got an idea, and when my mom called, I ran, I hid, I did the whole dead weight thing where I sat on the floor, but this time when she picked me up off the floor, I got the bright idea to squeeze my butt cheeks together as hard as I possibly could, and you know what? It worked. She couldn't administer the suppository. And my mother tried to coax me. She was like, come on, just be a good girl. It only takes a minute. It's medicine. It's going to help you. And I was not having any of it. And finally, my mother gave up. And she said, okay, go play. And immediately I felt this rush of victory. I won. Until my dad came home. And the next thing I knew, I was face down on the bed in the guest room. My dad had my ankles, my mom had my wrists, and my father spread my ankles as far apart as he possibly could, which weakened my little gluteal muscles, and I couldn't squeeze my butt cheeks together anymore, and I got my suppository again that night. So this became a nightly ritual for as long as that prescription was. I don't know if it was a 14-day prescription or a 30-day prescription, but when you're 3 years old, it feels like this is your life. Every night, we're going to have to go through this, and I'm going to have to experience this freezing cold, unpleasant suppository. So I put up a fight, a mean fight, and every night my dad would put me on the bed. I'm face down and I started thrashing like crazy. So my parents really had to restrain me. This one night, my mom slipped and let go of my wrist, and I was flopping my wrist around like crazy. And my dad said, get her wrist. She's hitting me. You need to grab her wrist and hold her. And my mother said to my dad, damn it, this kid is just too strong. And that was it. That was the magical moment when it hit me. I'm stronger than my parents. Now, this was monumental because as a small child, I had seen my parents as demigods. They were my windows to the world. To idolize my parents the way I did as a toddler, and then to hear one of these infallible people make the comment that I was too strong. My little 3-year-old brain interpreted that to mean that I was stronger than my mother. And I remember feeling this surge of, I'll just call it greatness, to realize that I had surpassed them in a certain area. In this sense, it was physical strength. That was my first arrogant thought. In early childhood, there's a lot of fantasy thought that occurs, and kids aren't always able to adequately process the things that they see and hear. If I were stronger than my parents, I wouldn't be getting a suppository, would I? I would just throw them off like I was the Incredible Hulk. But that's not what happened. I mean, I lost the battle every night and I got my medication. But in my mind, I really felt like, yeah, I got a chance here. I can take these people. And I started to become more physically wild. That prompted my parents to have more conversation about their disbelief in my tenacity. And so every night, it wasn't just my mom, it was my dad saying, this kid is unbelievable. This kid is a fighter. This kid doesn't give up. This kid is too strong. And I heard these comments over and over and over. Now, mind you, this wasn't my parents talking to me directly. It's not like my parents spoiled me and they were like, oh, you're so strong. You're so clever. You're so much more clever than everyone else. They didn't say anything like that. These were just innocent statements that my parents were making to one another. And I misinterpreted what I was hearing. So I believe that that is where my arrogance started, where the arrogant personality streak formed, how it first began. It's not my parents' fault. It's not even my fault. You know, I'm just a little kid. I don't know that that's inappropriate. I don't know that that's socially off-putting to think that you're better than other people. And I think that if my parents knew that I was thinking these thoughts, they would have corrected it. I mean, I think at some point they must have corrected the outward appearance, because I did grow up knowing that it was not nice to brag. It was not nice to make comments as if you're better than other people. So I never outwardly said anything, but I thought it and I felt it. And so when you're having private thoughts that nobody knows about, those thoughts can't be addressed, they can't be corrected, and they're just allowed to fester and grow. And so throughout my life, those thoughts were supported in various ways. So another thing that happened was that when I was 4 years old, my mom taught me how to read. And by the time I went to kindergarten, I already knew how to read. They didn't start teaching phonics until like first grade. So I was the only kid in my class that knew how to read. And when my teacher found out, she asked me to read an entire storybook to my class one day for story time. So I got to read to the class. This was something that was purely innocent and meant to encourage me in a talent or skill that I had. And I think it is a kindergarten teacher's job to encourage kids' skills and talents when they notice them. And that's all my teacher was doing. But since my teacher, an adult, was the only person who read to the class, and now I'm reading stories to the class, I began to equate myself with my teacher. And I think the main reason I started to equate myself with other adults at that time and elevating myself above other kids my age was because that was the same year that my brother was born. And since my parents had been so attentive to my emotional needs as a very young child, I mean, it was just the three of us, it was the Three Musketeers, and this is all I know. And now all of a sudden there's this other kid. They were very, very aware of how that could affect me. And so my parents wanted to make sure that I didn't feel cast aside or left out. And so my parents said things to me like, you're the big sister and you're going to be able to look after your brother. You're going to be able to care for him. You're going to help mom and dad take care of him. Again, totally innocent comment. But in my head, I really thought I was like a third parent, a third adult. And my parents, same thing, like they didn't do this to me. This is just how my mind worked. This one time when I was probably about 6 and my brother was 2, and my mother had like an important phone call or something that she had to take, you know, in a quiet area. So we lived in a 2-story house. My mom went up to the bedroom to take this phone call, and she told me, you're in charge. I want you to look after your brother and make sure he doesn't get into any trouble. I'm starting to develop more logical reasoning skills at this age, but I still need adults to model for me what certain things look like or what certain expectations are. So when my mother said to me, you are in charge, I just simply said to myself, well, what does my mom do? My mom is usually in charge, so I'll just do what my mom does. So my brother and I are playing, and I think he had like some kind of like Fisher-Price tool set. And there was this plastic hammer. And even though it was plastic, I mean, you know, the force of a 2-year-old, they can really hurt when they hit you. And my brother took this plastic hammer and he hit me right between my shoulder blades, and he hit me with the hammer really hard. So I said, don't do that. You know, don't hit me. And he did it again, as most toddlers do. You know, they don't listen the first time around. And I figured, you know, I gave him a warning and he didn't obey it after one command. So I ripped that hammer out of his hand. I grabbed his arm with one hand, and with my other hand, I just started spanking him. And I spanked this kid as hard as I possibly could. And this kid is screaming, ah, you know, like, no, you're hurting me. Stop. And of course, I don't care. I just keep hitting him. And the more he screamed, the more powerful I felt. It felt absolutely glorious to know that I could hurt someone and they could never do the same to me. Now, I shouldn't say never, because now my brother could kick my ass. But at the time, it was like, this kid can't hurt me. You know, the best he can do is hit me with a hammer, but I will destroy him. And it just felt so awesome. And I felt so powerful that I kept hitting him. I didn't care how much he pleaded with me to stop. The only reason I stopped, oh, this is awful. The only reason I stopped was because my hand hurt. So after a while, I was like, ow, you know, this hurts. I think I'll stop. So my brother is just like, he can't walk. He's crying. He's like, I'm telling mom. And I gave him this totally smug attitude. I was like, go ahead. Tell her. And you'll find out, you'll see, I'm allowed to spank you because I'm in charge. So finally, my mom gets done with her phone call and my brother's like, Mom, And he tells her what I did. And this was like off in another room. I just kind of stayed where I was. I was totally relaxed and confident and actually anticipating, the victory of having my mother put my brother in his place and inform him that I had every right to spank him and he must have done something to deserve it. But to my shock, my mother came over to where I was and she was livid and she said, "Did you hit your brother?" And I just very coolly and calmly said, "Yeah." Like, duh, of course I hit him. And she was like, "Why? Why would you do that?" I said, "Well, he was misbehaving. He hit me with a hammer and I told him not to hit me and he didn't listen. So I had to spank him." And my mother was like, "No, you don't spank your brother." And I was like, "What? Why not? You told me I was in charge." And my mom goes, "That doesn't give you the authority to hit your brother." So at this moment, I'm not understanding. I would say this actually qualifies as an example of splitting. A lot of times we think splitting is just somebody's all good or somebody's all bad, but really splitting is the inability to integrate, shades of gray in anything. So in my brain, in my little pea brain, I'm thinking she left me in charge. What does in charge mean? It means I have all the rights and privileges as my mother. I'm just modeling my behavior after her. I took an attitude with her like she was the one who was, stupid. I actually kind of looked at her like she was a flaming idiot. Like, what are you talking about? You told me that I was in charge, and now you're telling me that I shouldn't have done what I did? Now, obviously, my mother didn't understand where this was coming from. I can't explain why my mind misinterpreted it as I'm a third parent or I'm equivalent with my parents. But that's just how I interpreted it. And so that kind of gave me the cojones to kind of address my mother as an equal, and I'm not understanding, this is not a negotiation. So my mom just kind of had this look on her face like, oh my God, and basically ended it. Like she was like, "I'm not going to argue with a 6-year-old. And she basically said, "Don't you ever hit your brother again." And I was just like, fine, and I'm 6. I'm not 16, okay? I'm 6. And I had this attitude. Again, it came from a place of not understanding and not having clarity and misinterpreting events and conversations that had occurred in my life. None of this was my parents' fault. It wasn't my kindergarten teacher's fault. And it wasn't even my fault. But even though it's not my fault, today as an adult, it is my responsibility to manage my attitude. It wasn't until I was in my early 30s that I became aware that my attitude was not becoming and that certain people might be able to detect my attitude, even if I didn't outwardly say anything. And I realized that that was an aspect of myself that I didn't like and I wasn't happy with. So it's been about 15 years now that I have made a real conscious effort to deal with my arrogant streak. And so the way I deal with that is I have a series of what I call arrogance rituals. When I decided to start a YouTube channel, I knew I couldn't trust myself to introduce myself at the beginning of my videos because I would probably be talking about myself for like 4 minutes. That's why I decided that I was going to put myself last instead of first. That being said, I'm Jen Guerriero, and this is Poisonous People. Thanks for watching.